Hello and welcome to the Young Texas Summer Reform podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be starting a series about how to advocate and defend the traditional text position. So, this position is also called the ecclesiastical text, the confessional text, and there may be nuances in the way that people defend this position, but in essence, the traditional text position is the belief that the immediately inspired text was providentially preserved in transmission, is available today in the Masoretic Hebrew and Greek received text, and can be and has been translated accurately into vulgar tongues. So this position rejects that Scripture needs to be reconstructed. There are a number of names that people use to refer to this theology of Scripture, but I would say the most accurate are the traditional text, or perhaps, as Jeff Riddle has pointed or has called it, the confessional text. And I'll explain why in a moment, but let's get to something first. I want to talk about other names that people use, such as the TR only position or KJV only position. And in the polemic world, men like James White have called this textual traditionalism, textual emotionalism, things like this, which really just takes the label traditional text and tries to stigmatize it and weaponize it against people's sentiments and emotions, right? This kind of overwhelming push to say that, oh, tradition is bad and all of this kind of thing. When you use charged terms like that, know that you've fallen into the category of rhetoric and polemics. They aren't helpful terminology, and if anyone claims that the term textual traditionalism is trying to be helpful, then I don't think that you're being genuine. That seems to be a rather disingenuous position. Now, I'm not personally offended when people use the term TR only or KJV only to describe my position. But the reason I don't use those terms personally is because I don't believe them to be accurate or helpful. And the reason for this is because the traditional or confessional text position does not only use the TR or only use the KJV. And the theological framework is far more robust than just defending the Greek New Testament and or the King James Version. So if we're concerned with using accurate terminology, or at least the most descriptive terminology that we can, TR only and KJV only are the least helpful in communicating what we're actually trying to say. Which is why these terms have been pushed and used and weaponized by apologists for the critical text. It's a rhetorical strategy. And let me explain why this is quickly before we carry on. In the first place, these terms obfuscate the scope of what we're actually advocating for in two ways. The first is identifying the text or the translation as the primary focus of the argument. It's a rhetorical strategy. They frame the discussion by saying this is really just about the TR, or this is really just about Erasmus, this is really just about the KJV, this is really about this thing or that thing, and they always use these terms to get this in people's heads. This is just about the KJV. Ultimately, just about the KJV. And you see this in Mark Ward and James White's writings and presentations pretty consistently. They try to simplify the position, reduce the position by describing it as being just a dogmatic defense of the TR or the KJV. And all the while, they're ignoring the theological, historical, logical framework that undergirds the position. It's not just a position that defends a text and translation. It is a robust theological position that has a lot to say about transmission, about Greek and Hebrew, about translations, how we use translations. And if you kind of extrapolate to the edges of the position, even what preaching is, because this is a reformed position after all. So the position is far more robust than just the KJV or the TR. And I suspect this is why they tried to weaponize these terms. You know, maybe at one point they were helpful. They did describe something, but You say KJV onlyist, and 15 people, if there's 15 people in the room, they're going to come out with 15 different understandings of what KJV onlyism is. So we have to recognize that when we're advocating and trying to be persuasive, we can't let the conversation be hijacked by a misappropriation of terms. And if you notice, for example, James White, the more polemic that he gets, the more loose he gets with how he labels this position. And this kind of reveals that what I'm saying is true. The more emotive and the more riled up James White gets, the crazier names he calls the traditional text position. He goes and calls it, emotionalism, fundamentalism, traditionalism. He says it's like Mormonism, Catholicism, right? That's not someone that's trying to engage in a meaningful way with the position. That's someone using rhetoric, directly appealing to the sentiments that Protestants have of being called like a Mormon or like a Catholic. Things that are going to cause an emotive response in the viewer. The more polemic that James White gets, the more he uses these kinds of emotional appeals. So we have to have a defense against that. We have to be able to reasonably and calmly dismantle that kind of rhetoric, because that's all it is. It's just a polemic strategy. It's not a substantial argument, and yet people think it is. I mean, all the time you see the arguments from the dividing line make their way into Facebook groups, in real life, in your Bible study, and you have to know that James White does not think clearly on this issue, or a number of issues lately. But all that to say is terminology is important in any debate and any form of argumentation, and some terminology is less helpful than others. And in this case, it is used and weaponized to mislead and misdirect the conversation by framing the argument around these charged terms. So the second way that critical text advocates use terminology to obfuscate the discussion is they attach only to everything, the word only. And this word only has been used to convince people that onlyism is bad. Who said that onlyism was bad? Why are we in this mindset that and I wrote a whole article on this, but why would onlyism be a bad thing? It's distinctly a Christian thing to have exclusive positions. This onlyism isn't as actually, and this is the biggest problem I have with it from a logical perspective, it's implied in the discussion. In any discussion where there's two exclusive claims, both sides are taking up an onlyist position. No one would go around and ask, are you a Calvin only? Are you a Calvinist only? Are you an Arminius onlyist? No. You wouldn't look at someone who is holding firm on a defined position and say, well, are you a Trinitarian onlyist? Any time you make an exclusive claim, you are an onlyist. Is Jesus the way, the truth, and the life? Well, you're an onlyist now. Onlyism, by definition, is not a bad thing. And it's actually an implied reality of any debate, right? I believe in only my position. You believe in only your position. Now pull that out, and you start saying, well, I believe that there's only one Greek and Hebrew text. Oh, you're an onlyist. Well, why is that a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing not to be a pluralist? And because of this rhetoric, people are being convinced in this sort of pluralism as it relates to truth and bibliology. Like, what is going on right now, people? Christians distinctly are onlyists in a number of things, a great number of things. Anybody with a sound, built-out position on anything is going to be an onlyist. But this is part of the way that they hijack the conversation. They use these emotionally charged words and try to convince people that somehow it's a bad thing to be this. But what you need to realize is that, okay, that's not necessarily a reason not to believe in a position. Right? Now we could just throw it on the other side and say, well, are you a critical text onlyist? Are you a ESV onlyist? Right? When you apply the same rhetoric on the other side, they reject it and say, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. Well, why not? You only read the ESV, right? You only read the NASB, right? And that's a strong way to break someone out of this emotionally charged rhetoric. When you just say, hey, flip the script a little bit. Since it's not a logical argument, since it's not really any there's no substance to the argument, right? It's just, I'm rubber, you're glue, right? That's all that is. It's a meaningless term that has been emotionally charged for the sake of polemics and rhetoric. And so there are problems with a lot of the commonly used terms like KJV onlyism and TR onlyism. The position we're talking and I'm advocating about here isn't just about the King James. It's not just about the Greek Textus Receptus. And only or onlyism isn't exactly doing anything in the argument, in the label and in the argument, other than making an emotional appeal to people's pluralistic sentiments. So how did we get to a place where we've convinced so-called conservative evangelicals that like somehow onlyism is a bad thing? This is what happens when you learn your argumentation from someone that doesn't argue logically and then says they do. Because you're going to think all these irrational, emotive arguments are somehow logical and based in some sort of reasoning methodology. They're not. They're emotive claims. They're emotional claims. They're appeals to sentiment. They don't actually provide a substantial definition to what we're actually talking about. So that's why I advocate we avoid using these terms. Not necessarily because the terms may, we haven't even discussed if the terms themselves could be helpful. Could King James Version onlyism be helpful? Maybe at one point. But the polemic strategy of the evangelical critical text apparatus has been to strip meaning out of words, emotionally charge words, and then bash people over the head with those terms. Sounds a lot like the political left, doesn't it? Because that's what progressives always do with words. They always go after the definition and meaning of words. Always, 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 always. The political left and the evangelical left hate words. They hate that words can be defined as something and used in a meaningful way. And if you can manipulate and control terminology and definitions, then you can control a discussion. And they always do that. They always, always, always do that. So if we want to be accurate, we shouldn't use, in my opinion, the terminology King James Version onlyism or Textus Receptus onlyism, or let people take ground from you in a debate by letting them use it. Because you concede a lot of ground and give people the advantage of framing the debate on unhelpful, meaningless terms, and that's going to drive their argumentation, and you're going to find yourself in the middle of that conversation and realize they've taken too much ground in this argument. I have to work my way back and figure out, well, wait, how are you using the terminology that you're using? Because I had different definitions in my brain. That's how it works. When you let the other side of any discussion define your terms, you're going to have a hard time. You have to have meaningful definitions and hold the people you're talking to those definitions. Say, nope, this is what this means. The Bible means the Bible, not the manuscript tradition. You have to know these terms, and you have to defend these terms, and you have to give an explanation as to why these terms mean these certain things, because in 2021, I am convinced that there's some sort of very high functioning illiteracy happening in our culture, where people are very learned but they cannot think, and you have to fight through that. You have to combat that at every turn. So if we want to be accurate, I suggest not using King James Version onlyism. And I know some people choose to continue to use those terms, especially in sort of IFB circles, but I find them unhelpful based on the way that the critical text advocates have really taken over those terms and define them in whatever way they want to. So it's kind of a problem. So that's why I use traditional text or confessional text. So let's talk about why. Traditional text is descriptive of the whole text we're talking about and the methodology that kind of gets us to that text. It's not just TR onlyism about the Greek Textus Receptus. It's not just about a translation. It's the traditional text of the Protestant Church, Old and New Testament. So it's not just about fundamentalism. It's not just about the KJV. It's not just about the TR, the Masoretic Hebrew. Same with the term the confessional text position, because you're saying that the confessions and the people who wrote them had a reason for using the text they did, and you're saying that it is the whole text used by the confessional church in the 17th century and onward. So by using either of these terms, we are saying this is not just about Greek or English, though they're rolled up into that definition. So I find them extraordinarily more helpful than King James Version onlyism. You know, Letus used the term ecclesiastical text. I think that accomplishes the same purpose. But all three serve the purpose of framing the discussion in a much more broad sense, which is necessary because the conversation is wider than the KJV or the TR. You know, I've heard the Van Cleeks, they use the sacred text. There's a reason that a lot of people are pushing to create new terminologies, because the people who have argued in the past have given up terms, just given them over. And so if you're arriving to the conversation, you know, in the last 10 years, you go to use a term that used to mean something and find out that you actually have to create your own terminology and define it the way that it should be defined, because all the terms have been hijacked. So, you know, I know a lot of people that says we should unify around one name. I think that's impossible at this point. So this is why you need to actually understand how people are using words, because it's warfare. I mean, the way that people are using words right now. So by using better terminology, you can change the question that people ask and that you're going to answer, that says, you know, why the TR or why the KJV, frame it away from that, and why this whole text? Why am I reading this whole text? Why is this whole picture consistent? Why is this whole picture worth holding to? And then you're going to start getting into the territory of like maybe convincing someone that there's something more to your position than just, you know, base fundamentalism. So because the position is not just a defense of the TR or the KJV, it's a defense of a historical position, a theological position, and also as a product, a text and a translation. So TR only and KJV only describe only one facet of the discussion, and it's necessarily incomplete. So people are going to get the wrong idea of what you're even talking about and use that terminology to kind of emotively navigate the conversation. So one last thing I'll say, regardless of how descriptive our terminology is, we always need to remember that the conversation is three-faceted. And if you're not paying attention, this is a good point to start paying attention to right now. The conversation is broken into three major categories as I see it: theology, text, and translation. And if you do not know how to recognize a theological argument from a textual argument from a translational argument, you're going to find yourself upside down in one of these conversations. Because even if people call the position KJVO or TRO or traditional text, it isn't going to be just about the King James. It's not going to be just about the TR. And at some point, they are going to make theological claims. You need to be able to hear the difference between a theological claim and a evidence-based claim and a, you know, all sorts of different kinds of claims. You need to have an ear for this kind of thing. because in every discussion there will be appeals to every single category. Even if they try to make it just about the King James, or just about the science, they're going to make theological claims. They will. So that is the big takeaway from this first section. Remember these three categories: theology, text, translation, and do not let people confuse or conflate them to control the conversation. They're gonna try to blend these categories. They're gonna say, well, text criticism has shown overwhelmingly that we have the earliest and best text, and then at some point they're gonna start saying original, perhaps. That is a shift from a textual claim down to a theological claim. They do it all the time. You got to be able to recognize it. And they're going to start doing this conflation effort. They're going to start conflating your position, their position, by using poor terminology that they have charged heavily, at least since I've known the discussion exists. So if you've watched Mark Ward's presentation on this, for example, he begins by laying out the traditional text position pretty fairly, I would say, and ends by concluding that this is just King James onlyism. At that point, any attempt to actually have a nuanced or meaningful conversation is impossible. If we are in that room and we are in that conversation and we let people get away with that kind of sophomoric, ridiculous pageantry, we will never, ever have a good conversation. You have to stop them and say, wait, do you care about language? Do you care about words? Do you care about definitions? Because you just blundered big time. This is what these terms mean. This is how we agreed to use these terms. That's part of it. You can't lose the conversation, lose control of a conversation because you're confused about the way they're using terms. And they're going to do it. So even in, let's just say you're talking about the re-inspirationist kind of KJV view, it starts with a theological claim. It's not just about fundamentally defending the KJV. And men like James White have done the church a great disservice by convincing people that it is just root fundamentalism. It's just the KJV because the KJV. Well, even in the most extreme version of King James Version onlyism, it starts with a theological claim. And anybody thinking clearly can see that. God re-inspired the text in the King James Version. That's theological. That's not fundamentalist. That's not a motive. That is a theological claim. And if you had any integrity, you would recognize that. So let's move on to the next set of terms, beginning with the critical text. We've defined what the traditional text is, the kind of the position surrounding it. We've talked about how the conversation's often hijacked by using charged terms like King James Version only, TR only, textual traditionalism, things like this that are geared towards obfuscating the discussion, simplifying the discussion into something it's not. So let's talk about some terminology in the critical text side. So this term, the modern critical text or modern textual criticism, it's widely accepted. There's really not any pushback on this, and it's made of three distinct parts, just like we've been talking about: theology, text, translation. So anybody that tells you that, well, modern textual criticism doesn't have any theology, it's neutral, you got to be born yesterday if you actually believe that. So the critical text position begins by asserting that the scriptures have not been providentially preserved. See, there's the theological claim that backs up that's the foundation for their effort, and it needs to be reconstructed. Right? Let me prove this really fast. If they believed that the scriptures were not corrupted, they wouldn't be creating new Greek texts every couple years. They wouldn't be in the process of reconstructing. And so this is a really good test. If the person you're talking to can put together those two pieces of information, you have a chance of reaching them. Because a lot of people don't think about that, right? The fact that there is an ongoing effort to reconstruct the Bible means the Bible's not constructed. There are corruptions, places we do not know what it says. And you can show them Dan Wallace all you want, but if they've got this crazy blinder thing going on, which a lot of people do, they're going to say, oh, you're taking him out of context. Oh, you're slandering Dan Wallace, even though you just quoted him. This is the logical leap that that has brought a lot of Christians from critical text over to traditional text. It's pointing out to them, hey, I know you don't believe me when I say that your scholars say you don't have a Bible, but think about it yourself. Why are they reconstructing the Bible, ongoing effort, if they already have it? If the Bible you have in your hands is inspired, or at least usable as scripture, why is a new edition coming out? Why are they still working on it? That is a work in progress. And if you can capture that hill, any claim that they make about originality is out the window for them. They can't do it responsibly or honestly with integrity. So it begins by asserting that the text has not been providentially preserved and needs to be reconstructed. They state that we don't have perfect access to the scriptures, not in the original language manuscripts or in any texts, printed text, or in any translations do they say that we have the perfect word of God. They state that even if we did have a perfect underlying text, we could never translate it perfectly accurately, and therefore we have to use multiple translations, lexicons, study tools, right? To them, reading your Bible is a decoding effort. This is really interesting. Mark Ward uses that terminology about people reading the King James Version. A lot of their arguments are a huge effort in projection, because if they can convince their audience that the traditional text guys are doing what they're actually doing, then it causes people to look away from those parts of their position and kind of put the blinders on for it. But really, especially Mark Ward advocates for a very decoding type of Bible reading, the way that you're to read your Bible, with 3 translations open and all this sort of nonsense. But that's it in a nutshell. That's the critical text position, and it results in sort of believing, reading the ESV or the NASB or the NIV, right? So a less used term that people do use for this position is reconstructionalist text criticism. and this is accurate, not widely used, but it does accomplish the task of being more descriptive than what modern textual criticism is, right? Reconstructionist text criticism indicates that they're still building, they're reconstructing the Bible. Not widely used though, so use that at your discretion. People might not know what you're talking about or think that you're being overly polemic. It is also, in the critical text also has its own sort of version of a KJV only terminology. People call it textual agnosticism or textual atheism, critical text onlyism, ESV onlyism, but those are really just responses to what they've called people in the traditional text camp to kind of point out the ridiculousness of using terminology like that. So these are just as unhelpful as the pejoratives used on the other side, but they do have rhetorical purpose, right? All of these things have rhetorical value. So using a term like textual agnosticism or textual atheism can be very powerful if you're there in the conversation and you pointed out, hey, this is not Protestant, right? So in the next video, we're going to break down, some more definitions and really get into some of this information and how to actually navigate the conversation at a more nuanced level than I've got in today. Right now, we're just kind of sticking around terminology, what is the conversation overall. And next video, we'll kind of go into more depth. But the modern critical text is... so we talked about modern textual criticism. Now, the modern critical text is the product created by the methods of modern textual criticism. This is done by a combination of reasoned eclecticism and the coherence-based genealogical method. There's a fair amount of diversity of opinion, if you've ever talked to anyone, within this camp. But the general principle is that the text of Scripture was corrupted and needs to be reconstructed using textual data available today. And the goal of modern textual criticism is to create a history of New Testament textual transmission and to produce texts that from that historical record, which in theory can be translated ineffectively into various languages. So it's important to note that historically the goal of textual criticism was actually to reconstruct the original. And a lot of ground is lost when these scholars on our side. We lose ground when we let the scholars say that they're after the original by quoting saying, well, we want to find the original. We desire to find the original. They play with words. That is not the same as their methods actually being designed to find the original. Two totally different things, and it shows you how subversive they are. So the goal is just to describe the history of the New Testament textual transmission by determining in part which variant gave rise to the rest of the variants. So the anchor point for this whole methodology is earliest surviving manuscripts that we have today. And and perhaps if they're being a little adventurous, some sort of hypothetical text that our earliest surviving manuscripts allegedly came from. Now the problem is they can't find just one of those. So we will discuss this whole thing in depth later, but for now this is sufficient for our purpose. We need to know in our argumentation and in our mind that the critical text position doesn't have a concept of the original. It's not there. Not in the way they argue, not in the way... And this is one of the strategies. You have to actually get them to admit that we're not talking about the original. We're not... Any honest critical text defender will not defend the idea of the original Bible being available today. They won't do it. So before we move on, there are other positions worth mentioning if you're kind of new to the conversation and you're looking for a little bit of a crash course. You have different majority text positions, and I think it's fair to say that there isn't like one monolithic majority text position. There's different nuances, which family do we want to call the majority text and things like this. But in general, it means you take the majority reading found in all the manuscripts. That's the general gist of it, but understand that there are a fair amount of nuance between majority text position believers. And so in this camp, you kind of have people who are more on the side of the way that the critical text thinks. They're just, we're data-driven. We just think that the majority data is better. You also have people in this camp with a more theological position, kind of similar to the way that the TR onlyists, argue. They make an ecclesiastical argument for God preserving the original Bible in the majority of manuscripts. They say, the most is what God preserved. That's very reductionistic, but it's the general gist of it. The important takeaway is that majority text positions are distinct from critical text positions and are distinct from the traditional text position. And while there is overlap on both sides, if we want to be clear, use the right terms. You have big problems with men like James White and Andrew Naselli conflating majority text positions with the TR defense of the TR and the defense of the Masoretic Hebrew text, the received text position, so-called. In James White's book, he conflates the majority text with King James Version only. And it's just not honest. It's lacking virtue. It's lacking integrity. And then the second position, kind of niche that I want to talk about, is James Snapp's equitable eclecticism, which is still a Reconstructionist model, so it's more like the critical text position, only it rejects the idea that the Byzantine text was an evolution from Alexandrian and Western text. It also, if you kind of look at the canons of it, has more sensible rules, which assume that the earliest texts are that an early witness is more likely to be elegant and not choppy. Like, if you take a look at the rules of reasoned eclecticism, like, they basically say that the shoddiest version of the Bible was the original. That's their premise, which is should be enough to cause Christians, at least, to kind of turn their head. So James Snap's equitable eclecticism is kind of what I would imagine textual criticism should look like if an evangelical or a Christian is doing it. I think there's errors in it. Obviously, it's a reconstructionalist model, so there are theological problems with this issue. But like, if you're going to reject the theological grounds for that, if you're going to reject that the Bible's like a theological document, this is kind of the or you're going to reject that we should use theology to determine what Bible we read and use. James Snap's position is I think the much more faithful position, though I don't think it's a great position. Just put it out there. I'll probably do a video addressing equitable eclecticism, majority text, kind of in its own category later on. So I want to talk next about why it's important to understand the general scope of the whole discussion. Kind of zooming out a little bit, doing some recap to kind of bring you guys back into the conversation. We defined what the majority text was, equitable eclecticism. And one last note on that, it ends up looking a lot like the TR and James Snap position does. It's very much so kind of similar enough to the majority text, practically speaking. It's just his methods are a little different. We talked about equitable eclecticism, majority text, critical text, the traditional text position. So we have some basic kind of framework going on. And most importantly, we talked about the threefold categorization of this discussion: the theological component, the textual component, and the translational component. So why is it important that we understand this whole discussion in that kind of terminology? It's because this conversation is dominated at both the academic and popular level by misrepresentation. Read any book that tries to address the traditional text position. They inevitably get something wrong about what the position actually adheres to. For example, James White including majority text positions as a part of his King James only framework, or Mark Ward calling the traditional text position no different from King James Version onlyism. The conversation is confused because the leading voices having the discussion are actually confusing the discussion themselves. They refuse to acknowledge clear and precise category distinctions, which is one of probably my largest critique of James White, that he's always talking about categories, consistency, and he constantly violates those principles. I mean, in every single one of his arguments, he violates one of these principles. And he's convinced people that they're thinking clearly when they're absolutely not thinking clearly. It is beyond me how people still watch that man. So my hope is, with this first segment in my video series of how to adequately defend and be persuasive for the TR traditional text, KJV, however you want to call it, position. I'm going to call it, going forward in this video series, the confessional text position or the traditional text position. Going forward in this series, I will be using that. In this video, I'm kind of jumping back and forth to kind of remind my audience it doesn't matter. We need to be thinking in terms of substance of the argument, not what we're calling the argument, right? Because the terms have been hijacked across the board. So what we need to do, my hope and the big takeaway of this video, I know we're going on a little long here, is that people would just simply recognize the obvious and clear distinctions that exist in the conversation. King James onlyism in its substance is different from the traditional text position. In its substance is different from the majority text, is different from equitable eclecticism, is different from the critical text position, and we need to be honest about these categories. Further, someone who rejects modern versions may do so on grounds entirely different from any of these categories we've talked about today. And we have to remember that. This conversation is not as simple as based fundamentalism as Mark Ward and James White would like to have you believe. It's just simply not the case. So if you were to try to have a conversation with someone like James White, Mark Ward, you're guaranteed that you're going to hear something wrong from them. You're guaranteed that they're going to misrepresent something or perhaps even lie, which they have done. So I want to go on a little tangent before I move on. There's also critical text advocates who have only heard John MacArthur or John Piper. They've maybe seen D.A. Carson, or maybe Dirk Youngkind, perhaps his little pamphlet. And this video series should be especially helpful to you because part of the purpose is undoing a lot of the polemic rhetoric. If we can think clearly in theological categories, textual categories, and translational categories, the power of a lot of their emotive rhetoric goes away. We have to be able to do that. So the major takeaway from this section is that there are a number of textual positions, more than just KJV onlyism and what sane people believe. There is the modern critical text position, a number of modern critical text positions. There is equitable eclecticism, various majority text positions. There are a lot of nuance at each end of these camps, which is why we need to be able to navigate this discussion in a comprehensive way if we actually want to be persuasive to the critical text advocate who maybe doesn't understand the implications of what they're advocating for. So the final segment of this video is going to be about how to have the discussion. If you're new to the conversation or have just been around for a while, this should be helpful. As I've stated, one of the biggest problems is surrounding the way people have been having this conversation in general. The way that people have been taught to engage this topic is full of blatant category conflations and misrepresentations of terminology and of people and all sorts of things. And in order to have a meaningful conversation, you have to establish categories, you have to define terms, and then you have to make sure everybody is operating within these categories and terms. And I know that sounds very like a lot of work. It's an arduous task to say, hey, this is what I mean by this, and this is how I'm defining that, and we're going to be accountable to these terms we're agreeing upon right now. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it not giving ground away because someone is intentionally confusing your categories and mislabeling and misusing your terms. You have to be able to hear an argument, put it into categories in your head, and address the merit of everything in its proper category. That is how you have to navigate this discussion. You can refute a lot of critical text arguments by simply pushing things into their category and addressing them properly in their category, very simply. So you have to be able to recognize when somebody is making a bad argument and how to refute it on its grounds, not at its ends. You also have to be able to recognize, contrary to, let me back up a little bit. Contrary to popular belief, this discussion is not about debating textual variants. It's a theological debate down to its very core. All claims made about evidence are done from a theological starting point, and these claims need to be evaluated from the starting point, not the end point. For example, the earliest and best argument. What assumptions undergird that statement? Who decided what was earliest and best? How was that done? Why are we debating what is earliest and best, not what is original? Why are early and best even criteria we are subjecting the scriptures to? Why would we care about what's earliest? We want what's original. We want what Paul wrote. No, you don't, James White. Not in your methodology. Early is not the same as original, and best is not the same as inspired. The conversation has been entirely gutted of its theological language and replaced with nonsensical categories like early and best that do not align with what Christians believe about Scripture. We care about original and inspired, not earliest and best. So the first step to having this conversation, practically speaking, and being persuasive in it, is to understand, recognize, and communicate the three major categories of this discussion. Saying that the critical text is based on earliest and best manuscripts is a clear departure from thinking that we need to look at the Bible as original and inspired. Earliest and best is a departure from Christian theology. And if we were just able to communicate that, we would at least convince a lot of people that what they're holding to is not historical, not Protestant, and barely even Christian. And it's very rare that you will find a critical text advocate that will back to their theological grounds. They will let the veil slip occasionally, but they avoid it at all costs. There's a good reason why. Every last one of their claims about texts, about translations, is invalidated by their theology of text and translations. That is why, for example, James White goes to great lengths to discredit theological arguments, calling them like Mormonism or Catholicism or whatever he wants to call them, or, Reformationolatry, stuff like that. The reason he goes after these theological positions is because if he were to actually address them and compare them against what he believes about the Bible, what the Bible is, and all that, it would become very apparent what he's actually saying about Scripture. In fact, just one example on that point. When White was pressed by Jeff Riddle in the debate, he was asked, do you believe that there's any ultimate or final standard to evaluate text by? And James White laughed and said, of course not. You have to be able to understand what that means. So when we go into these conversations, we need to define what our theology of Scripture is. What is the Bible? What's the Bible for? Who is the Bible for? Do we have the Bible as defined? What is a translation? So on and so forth. When you start having these kinds of conversations with people, you will quickly find that Christians in the critical text camp do not have the same definition of the Bible and who it's for and what it's used for as you. You will find they have a very low view of Scripture, a low view of the translation they're reading probably, and you will find that they have an incomplete description of the purpose of Scripture. They say, well, it's just good enough to get people saved. That's half of it. It's powerful unto salvation, but it's also powerful to train you up, instruct you, rebuke you, exhort you. Read all of 2 Timothy 3, not just part of it. So these are the grounds we have to have a conversation on. What do you think the Bible is? How are you defining the Bible? Important questions. The second task is quite easy once we have clearly defined our theology and made them clearly define their theology of Scripture. So I'll just provide some definitions at the close here. Text, we have theology. What is the Bible? What are the Scriptures? What are translations? What are they used for? That's the theological category. Next, we have text. Text is just the Hebrew and Greek original texts. And the theological question pertaining to these is, do you believe we have the original or just partial access to the original, so on and so forth? But the textual category is specifically, which text are we advocating for? Masoretic, Hebrew, or the critical text Greek, or how do we want to navigate that conversations? And there are theological components to this, but just at face value, let it exist in its own category. And when people make theological claims about that text, move back into theology. Always try to navigate the conversation back to theology. Always, 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 always. It is the kryptonite of the critical text position. And the final category is translation. What method should be used to translate the text? What is the translated text? Do translations have authority? And how should translated text be used? This is really important because when talking about translations, lately the modern critical text advocate has lost their dang mind. It's a very important category to define. It puts things in its proper place. And if you address the theological, if you can get from translation to theology of translation, you will have so much power in that argument. Don't let them sit on just, readings in the KJV and sit there and sit in the translation category. Bring them back to theology. What do you actually believe the translation is? Do you believe that translation is perfectly translated? If not, it's not inspired. It's not useful to you. Get them to that point. Let them reveal how unorthodox their position is. So I will handle all of these categories in upcoming videos in depth. So I'm just going to summarize here and we'll kind of finish up. So effectively advocating the traditional text or confessional text position of Scripture begins with understanding the categories theology, text, translation, and you have to be able to recognize a theological claim, a textual claim, and a translational claim. And the power in your argumentation comes from being able to come back to the theology of these categories. What is your theology of what the Bible is? What is your theology of what the original texts are? What is your theology of your translation? If you can bring it back there, you can get them to admit that their bibliology, their theology is not orthodox. And for a lot of people, they haven't thought of it that way. They thought, well, I listened to trusted scholars. I didn't actually investigate my position for orthodoxy, which they should have. But if they come to that conclusion on their own, to the point where they're saying, oh, I'm saying I don't have a Bible, it's compelling. It's very compelling. The next part is having a good understanding of all the terminology in this discussion. Now, that's a little bit in the weeds, but at least know what modern textual criticism is at a meta level, know what the traditional text position is at a meta level, know what all these like terms that come up in the discussion mean at a basic level, so that you know them enough to not let people hijack the terms, right? I mean, we can use KJV onlyist as sort of a, an example of this. What does KJV mean? To James White, it's everyone that doesn't read a modern version. To some people, it's the people who believe the KJV was re-inspired. To some, it's the traditional text position. And when you have such a wide variance of positions, the term is useless. So we have to get people to agree to terms before we go off and have a crazy conversation with them. So I'll end here. If you can get to the part of the conversation that matters, you can actually win people to the historical orthodox view of Scripture. And that is what we have to keep in mind. A lot of critical text advocates haven't thought down to the bottom of their argument. They haven't considered what it means that some of the Scriptures have been corrupted, that the Bible's not finished. They haven't considered what it means theologically to not have a perfectly accurate translation. And if you can get them to the theological parts of this discussion, you can actually and effectively persuade people, at least at the bare minimum, that their position is not Protestant, not Christian, but perhaps even bring them over to a traditional text or confessional text position. The biggest mistake people make in this discussion is letting the critical text advocate talk about the textual data as though they have anything to say about it. When you stick in the text category, and you don't bring it back to theology, if you stay in the translation category and don't bring it back to theology, you're going to get beat up in these conversations. What you have to realize is that the critical text position doesn't make any claims about originality of any of their texts. They just call it earliest and best. So why would you waste your time arguing about a category that has nothing to do with the original? Why would you? Push them onto theological grounds and watch them flounder. Watch them try to defend their claims from Scripture. They cannot do it unless they want to say we don't have full access to the Scriptures and never will. So understanding how to have this conversation is very, very, very important to being persuasive. Learn the categories and how to recognize a theological claim versus a textual claim versus a translational claim. And in the discussion, always bring it back to theology. Always bring it back to theological claims. Because this is their loophole. They say our position is scientific. Our position is scholarly. We're not making any theological claims. Yes, they are. Recognize them and back them onto those grounds. And they will flounder and struggle to answer your questions. And you might even persuade someone. So this has been part one of the how to advocate the received text position or the traditional text position or the confessional text position. Again, we will be using the terms traditional text and confessional text going forward just for ease of access for everybody. This has been the Young Textualism Reform podcast with your host, Taylor DeSoto. Expect some future parts in this series. I hope this has been helpful to you. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you all in the next video.